In Shadowlands, Frost Death Knights can once again choose what weapon type they would like to use, either dual wield or a two-hand weapon. There seems to be a lot of misconceptions going around as to what's best for what and exactly what the difference is between these two playstyles. Some people even think that's just a cosmetic option. Well, today I'm going to dispel those myths, and I'm going to share with you how you can double down on their strengths and on their weaknesses, so whichever way you want to play your Frost DK, then you can make sure that you're kicking butt and taking names in Shadowlands. But first, a word from our sponsor, my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/XodasWow. I go live every Wednesday and Friday evening at 5 p.m. Central Standard Time, so come and watch two-hand Frost DK PvP, discuss everything Death Knight and Shadowlands, and have a good time. Link in the description down below. So let's start with Dual Wield Frost DK. Dual Wield excels at doing high consistent damage. This comes from their high runic power saturation, which means that they have less dead zones, and since most of their damage comes from their frost damage, this means that they have very consistent high damage inside and outside of burst. Dual wield strengths are found in that consistent high runic power saturated frost damage centric playstyle. They do extremely well with abilities like Breathless Gosa, Frost Scythe, and the newly buffed Glacial Advance. All of these abilities happen to be AoE abilities. They also happen to rely on having an abundance of runic power at your disposal. On top of that, they all primarily do frost damage, which does mean that overall these do scale with Frost DK mastery, but with Dual Wield it really lets that frost damage shine because you don't see so much of that physical damage kind of trying to steal the spotlight. This makes Dual Wield Frost extremely powerful in PvE content in comparison to two-hand, and this means for PvP that Dual Wield has the runic power and the Runeforge versatility, since they can have two different Runeforges, to be extremely defensive. Their potential for weaving Deathstrike into their rotation is much better than two hands, albeit it does still come at a DPS loss, but is not as severe as it is for two-hand Frost DK. Dual Wield Frost's weaknesses are only found when directly compared to two-hand Frost. Dual Wield Frost's weakness is definitely its lack in single target damage in direct comparison to two-hand. It does not do as much single target damage, but that's because its specialty is using its frost damage to do insane AoE damage. This weakness shows itself in Dual Wield Frost DKs in current BFA. In Arena, you rely on other classes like Shamans, Windwalker Monks, and Demon Hunters for their AoE stuns so that you can set up large chill streaks to try and get kills. Once again, relying on AoE frost damage is the specialty of Dual Wield Frost DK. So to take full advantage of the Dual Wield playstyle, here is a talent build that I recommend. Inexorable Assault is top notch for its single target pressure. This really helps to cover up the weaknesses of Dual Wield Frost DK. Icy Talons in theory should be better for Dual Wield, but when you test it, it comes like drastically short. I don't know if there is something that makes this talent not work properly, or why this isn't working, because in theory, Icy Talons should be the choice, but it is drastically, obviously not the right choice. The damage is just not there. Runic Attenuation works perfectly with Dual Wield Frost. This is the best option in this row to really play into Dual Wield Frost's strengths. For the level 35 row, Frozen Pulse is an amazing choice for Dual Wield because it once again scales with weapon attack speed, which is absolutely awesome. Frost Scythe is another really great choice, specifically for PvE though, because it's basically AoE Obliterate that deals frost damage, which is great for Dual Wield Frost. For the level 45 row, Gathering Storm is a jack of all trades. This talent's really great because it turns your Remorseless Winter into a very formidable burst cooldown that deals once again AoE frost damage that plays into Dual Wield Frost strengths. Hypothermic Presence is another great option on this row though, and it is definitely the winner for the utility pick. This helps in PvE because it makes your Breath of Sindragosa last longer, and this is great in PvP because it allows you to get more healing out of your healing cooldowns like Lichborn and Transfusion. And Glacial Advance is a bit of a wild card. Historically, Glacial Advance has been garbage, but it recently got a buff in Shadowlands, and although I haven't had a chance to test it quite yet, it could potentially be a hidden gem for PvE Frost DK. For the level 50 row, as a dual wield Frost DK in PvE, you're always going to want to take Breath of Sindragosa. It is just too good of a PvE ability to not take it. Now in PvP, then you're going to want to consider taking Obliteration or Ice Cap. In the Shadowlands pre-patch PTR, Ice Cap is a really strong choice because we still have the Azurite traits for Frostwelt's Indignation and Icy Citadel, which do all kinds of wonderful things for our Pillar of Frost. But in Shadowlands, we will be losing those Azurite traits, and I'm thinking the Ice Cap for sure is going to fall behind. In PvP, Breath isn't a bad choice, but it definitely does become a little less practical the higher rating you get. It is extremely easy, I mean really simple, to just completely shut down a Breath of Sindragosa DK instantly the moment they pop their Breath of Sindragosa. Now it's time to talk about Two-Hand Frost DK. Two-Hand's strength is in its sheer damage output. In comparison to Dual Wield Frost DK, Two-Hand's burst damage can only be described as nuclear. Two-Hand has much more kill potential in PvP, both inside and outside of burst, not relying so heavily on those chill streak setups just to get a kill. Two-Hand excels for this reason in PvP and in PvE as a boss buster. But as for its weaknesses, Two-Hand does suffer from losing damage when it goes defensive, and this is because of how expensive and how weak Deathstrike is in comparison to everything else in the Two-Hand Frost DK toolkit. Dual Wield has the runic power to just dump into Deathstrikes over and over and over again, and they see a much smaller damage loss in comparison to Two-Hand when they do that. But for Two-Hand, it takes all of our runic power, leaving really nothing left, and we do less damage and not much healing while we're doing it. Deathstrike is a very costly action for Two-Hand, and it does little damage by Two-Hand standards. The profit to loss ratio just isn't there for Two-Hand Frost DK. It kills your offensive pressure and it barely heals you for anything, so it just really perpetuates this prolonged state of I want to heal more so I can last long enough to get back to doing more offensive pressure, but because you're not really making any progress, you're just kind of stuck spinning your wheels in this defensive mode. Pairing your Deathstrike with defensive cooldowns like Icebound Fortitude and Transfusion do alleviate these problems to a certain degree, but you still run into the problem of it just completely kills your offensive pressure. This is why Lichborn is extremely important to Two-Hand Frost DK, because it allows you to keep your offensive pressure high while still healing for a ton of health. Now, don't get me wrong, just like how Dual Wield doesn't do bad damage, it just does less damage in comparison to Two-Hand. Two-Hand doesn't do bad healing. It just does less healing in comparison to Dual Wield. But by any other melee class's standards, Frost DK is at the top of the hierarchy in both damage and healing. The secret to defending yourself against this weakness is not relying too hard on Deathstrike. You need to learn to use your Lichborn to the best and fullest potential you can possibly use it to. This is going to allow you to keep your offensive pressure high while still healing for nearly all of your health bar. Now let's talk about how we can double down on Two-Hand Frost strengths and cover our weaknesses a little bit better using our talents. For our first row, Inexorable Assault is still the go-to pick since it doubles down on the obliterate damage that Two-Hand Frost so heavily relies on. For the level 25 row for Two-Handed Frost DKs, you want to take Murderous Efficiency. This works the best with Two-Hand because it gives you more runes back, and this means more obliterates, doubling down on our strengths of focusing on that giant obliterate damage. For the level 35 row, Avalanche takes the cake in short-term high burst damage. However, in more long form kind of combat, so in PvE or dampening meta arenas, then we see Frozen Pulse actually pulling ahead for Two-Hand Frost as well. Between these two abilities, Avalanche does more damage up front, but over time does less damage, and Avalanche does less damage up front, but over time does more damage. So it comes down to what kind of content you're doing as to which one of these two talents you're going to want to pick. For the level 40 talent row, which I skipped for Dual Wield, but I did want to cover something important for Two-Hand, is that Permafrost has been a very popular choice for Dual Wield for a very long time. However, since Permafrost scales with weapon attack speed, it becomes very underwhelming very quickly for Two-Hand Frost DK. Death Pact is a much more viable option because it gives us more upfront, on-demand, instant healing that allows us to keep our offensive pressure high and keeps us away from falling into the trap of spamming Death Strike. That's the big goal for Two-Hand, is how can I use Death Strike as little as possible so that I can maintain my high burst damage. That is what a lot of Two-Hand in PvP comes down to. The only thing about Death Pact is that it does come with that negative debt. So I do recommend that you save it as a last resort. I like to use it once every other defensive cooldown I have is on cooldown. It is my last resort, and I also don't recommend waiting until you're too low health to use Death Pact. Personally, I like to use it around 50% health. This way I don't waste any of the heal, but this also means that I have a lot of health behind my debt. That way I don't have to worry about getting just completely buried by that healing debt that Death Pact gives you. For the level 45 talent row, Gathering Storm is once again an amazing ability to just transform your Remorseless Winter into a formidable burst cooldown. However, in PvP, Hypothermic Presence is very useful, especially for Two-Hand Frost DK, because it allows you to get even more out of that Lichborn, which, as I described a couple of times now, allows you to keep your offensive pressure high, and that's what Two-Hand lives and dies on. So this is very important for using that. However, if you are in PvE, or if you are in maybe 3s or something where your personal healing doesn't really matter so much, then I do highly suggest you take Gathering Storm for the extra damage. For the final row for Two-Hand Frost, Obliteration is the go-to. That's because it doubles down on big obliterate damage, lots of killing machine procs, and it encourages the weaving playstyle, which is going to give you a lot less dead zones and a lot more uptime as a Two-Hand Frost DK. More about weaving and dumping and resource management in general right over on the screen right now. You should see the results of some testing I did between Dual Wield and Two-Hand, where I tested their base DPS rotation and their burst in a single target situation. I removed my Heart of Azeroth, Legendary Cloak, and proc trinkets, leaving the only variants in my rune forges, since they are so necessary and quite reliable as far as proc chance goes to both playstyles. This was done on the Shadowlands PTR, which means we are lacking quite a bit of obliterate damage that we will be getting along the way in Shadowlands as we level up and as we acquire conduits and legendaries. Sadly, Blizzard took it upon themselves to completely tune Frost DK around those Shadowlands implementations. So what we're seeing because of this is Dual Wield Frost DK. It has a much more complete and well-rounded toolkit surrounding its mastery and its frost damage, whereas Two-Hand Frost is really kind of waiting on that 30%, I'm not even kidding, 30% increase to physical obliteration damage and obliterate to scale with mastery. All this will of course help Dual Wield too, but it will definitely prop up the spec of Two-Hander much more than it would Dual Wield Frost. But even so, Two-Hand still manages to squeeze by Dual Wield and burst, and Dual Wield does manage to squeeze by Two-Hand in consistent damage, proving it's not just a cosmetic difference, and it's also not just an allocation of damage situation either. Two-Hand does more single target damage, Dual Wield does more AoE damage, Dual Wield is more defensive in nature, and Two-Hand is more offensive in nature. So consider this myth busted. Hit the like button if you enjoyed the video, make sure you hit subscribe and you ring that bell notification if you want to see more videos from me about Death Knights in Shadowlands. And without any further ado, I hope you enjoyed the video, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.